ask you a little bit about the elephant in the room, which you are not responsible for, but it still, I assume, affects you, which is high drug prices and high cancer drug prices. Dr. Lowy, how does it affect you? Does it affect you, how you do your job?
Well, our primary responsibility is to try to develop evidence for new interventions. And we specifically don't set drug prices. On the other hand, if we make advances which paradoxically increase health disparities because those advances are not available to all people, this really is a societal issue which needs to be dealt with. And clearly there's just been so many high-profile issues of with many suggestions of how to try to deal with the high cost. And at the risk of making things even worse, where I see the future is we're going to be having combination drug treatment, and combination treatments with 2 or 3 expensive drugs will make things even more complicated than with one.
Well, that's interesting because we are seeing some increased disparities in patient access to some of these therapies, especially, for instance, on something like the CAR-T therapies for blood cancers. There are issues about how much Medicaid will pay, how much Medicare will pay, and that's causing some problems among patients in terms of patient access.
Certainly, the issue of financial toxicity, bankruptcy, et cetera, are problems that are front and center with far too many patients who have cancer. You know, the dictum, your medicine or your mortgage, you know, as a dilemma is something that really is very unfortunate.
Dr. Pazdur, how does it affect you, or does it affect you?
Well, we don't make decisions based on cost, okay? In fact, I really have no idea as far as the exact dollar amount that the drugs are going to be marketed at when we approve a drug. So we're somewhat agnostic to the issue of in making a regulatory decision, the cost of the drugs. We simply look at safety and efficacy. Nevertheless, this is a major problem that's facing oncology. Does anybody have the answer to this? I don't think anyone has the answer to it. I think it really requires a continued discussion about what are the value of comparing different drugs in a different setting. I think that's a very important issue. But these become very complicated issues because none of the drugs have the exact same clinical trial. They frequently fit niche patient populations. So it's a very difficult question to answer. But from a regulatory point of view from the FDA, we're not looking at cost when we make a regulatory decision.
Ellen, how did you get involved in cancer advocacy, and how has the field changed over the last several decades?
Well, my story is a personal story. My sister died of breast cancer at 40. She was diagnosed at 32. And she died of a bone marrow transplant, but she had metastatic disease. And I will never forget going home. She was treated in North Carolina, telling her 4-year-old daughter that she would never see her mother again. So that was extremely painful. We were very young and young children, and it was horrible. And I did what most people do. I started getting involved in raising money for cancer research at Duke and other places. And then I realized quickly that this problem isn't going to be solved at one place. It really needed a foundation and support for basic research and for translational research. And I served on the board of the National Cancer Advisory Board for 6 years, and Rick Klausner, who was the director at that point, asked me to form Friends for 1 year, and I said, well, what do you want? And everybody who knows Rick Klausner would say, he said, I want 300 things. I said, no, tell me one thing you want. And he said, well, we need funding for research. I did this now, it's 23 years later. However, I understand now that basically the research and the foundation is urgent, but if it doesn't get to patients, and if it doesn't help patients, it doesn't work. And even the drug pricing, which is a huge problem. The prices are too high, and patients are not getting access. But what we don't want is to stop the innovation and the precision medicine. What we want is not cheap drugs that don't work. We want drugs that will work for the patient, on the first time they get it. That's the continuum. So, so the advocacy that we have at Friends of Cancer Research is really about regulatory innovation, but we don't want things on the market, and thank God for Rick Pazdur and the people at the FDA, they're not putting things on the market that don't work. There has to be a standard, and we have to get them out to patients, because if they're not out, they're not getting access, and often they're getting ineffective treatments.